Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more captivating tales to life. A Titan's reckoning, the return of a forgotten past. The relentless flash of cameras illuminated Alexander Thorne's tanned face as he adjusted his Italian silk tie. At 40, he had mastered the art of the first 30 seconds, the crucial window that determined whether investors would open their wallets or seal them shut forever. Behind him, the towering glass and steel monoliths, monuments to his ambition, mirrored the shimmering lights of Madrid. The Crystal Palace wasn't just another real estate venture. It was his declaration of war against the architectural mediocrity that had plagued the capital for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of Madrid. His voice boomed through the wireless microphone as he strode across the temporary stage in the complex's central plaza. 300 guests filled the pristine white chairs, a sea of bankers in 5,000 euro suits, politicians with practiced smiles, discreet journalists with their recorders, and Madrid's elite, those who had turned real estate speculation into their favorite sport. Patricia Davis, his personal assistant for the past 8 years, observed from the sidelines, tablet in hand. She had meticulously orchestrated every detail, from the Ramon Freixa catering to the lighting that made the towers appear to float above the city. Her efficiency was Alexander's greatest asset, allowing him to focus on what he did best: selling dreams wrapped in concrete and glass. In the front row, Madrid's mayor, Edward Vance, sat beside the directors of major investment banks. Their presence was no accident. The project had demanded urban planning modifications only his political backing could secure. Favors in Madrid were paid with construction contracts, a lesson Alexander had learned faster than most. For 15 years, I've transformed abandoned lots into homes where families build their lives. I've turned forgotten neighborhoods into vibrant centers of commerce and culture. But I've never faced a challenge like this. Alexander gestured towards the towering structures behind him. Each apartment within them cost more than an entire house in the towns where he'd grown up. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he'd learned to bury such thoughts under layers of economic justifications and theories of urban progress. A memory surfaced unbidden, as it always did during moments of intense pressure. Valdepeñas, 1995. His father hauling cement sacks at their small family construction business, while he crunched numbers at a splintered wooden table. Carmen sketching blueprints by hand because they couldn't afford code software. Both of them dreaming of building homes working families could afford. It had taken years to convince himself that abandoning all that had been the right decision. The Crystal Palace isn't just a residential complex. It's the embodiment of a vision that will transform Madrid's skyline for generations to come. Investors nodded as Alexander unfurled the figures they had memorized over weeks of preparation. 22 profitability in the first 3 years, guaranteed 40% appreciation in a decade, exclusivity that would turn each apartment into a symbol of social status. Michael Reed, investment director at Santander Bank, scribbled notes in his leather-bound notebook. His approval had been crucial for initial funding, but Alexander knew bankers changed their minds as easily as they changed ties. Patricia discreetly signaled from her spot. Everything was on schedule. In 10 minutes, the tour of the model apartments would begin, followed by a cocktail on the penthouse terrace. Preliminary contracts were ready for signing before the night ended. We are redefining the concept of urban luxury. Each apartment boasts cutting-edge smart home technology, imported Italian materials, and panoramic views that turn every sunrise into a private work of art. The crowd applauded as LED screens displayed images of the apartment interiors. Carrara marble in the bathrooms, Kitchens designed by German architects, terraces that seemed like suspended gardens over the city, all calculated to awaken the desire to own something their neighbors could only dream of. Alexander had perfected the art of selling aspirations. He didn't sell apartments. He sold the fantasy of belonging to an exclusive circle where money bought not just comfort, but social identity. The murmur of the crowd shifted. Alexander looked up from his notes and saw several guests turn their heads towards the main entrance. An elegant woman walked confidently through the chairs, with the assurance of someone who knew exactly her place in the world. Carmen Vance had changed over the 15 years since their last encounter, but her presence was unmistakable. Her brown hair now bore silver streaks framing a face that had gained character what it had lost in youth. Her navy blue pantsuit and the leather briefcase in her left hand suggested professional success and intellectual authority. But it wasn't Carmen who had captured the attention of the attendees. The teenager walking beside her was a miniature version of Alexander Thorne. The same green eyes, the same square jaw, even the same slightly hunched walk. Matthew was 14, and every one of his features screamed a truth Alexander had spent a decade and a half trying to ignore. Patricia approached the stage with a worried expression, but Alexander waved her back. Journalists began to whisper among themselves, focusing their cameras on the pair who had just taken 2 seats in the back row. Carmen crossed her legs and opened her briefcase with precise movements, extracting a manila folder and a pen as if preparing to take notes during a university lecture. Her expression was professional, almost clinical, but Alexander knew enough about body language to detect the tension in her shoulders. Silence spread through the plaza as guests waited for his presentation to continue. Alexander realized he had been watching Carmen for longer than appropriate for an experienced speaker. As I was saying, the Crystal Palace represents an investment in the future of Madrid. His voice sounded less confident than before, but he managed to regain his stride. Yet, a part of his mind remained fixated on Carmen's presence and the implications of her appearance at this specific moment. Matthew had pulled out a notebook and was drawing something while listening. His movements were identical to those Alexander remembered from himself at that age, when he dreamed of designing buildings that would change the world instead of simply generating profits. The presentation continued, but the balance of power in the plaza had irreversibly shifted. The presentation ended with polite applause, but Alexander barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on the woman now approaching the stage with measured, professional steps. Carmen Vance had waited until the last guest finished clapping before rising from her seat. "Mr. Thorne, I am Carmen Vance, urban architect from the Madrid City Council." Her voice cut through the air with the precision of a scalpel. The journalists still in the plaza turned their heads towards her, instinctively sensing that something important was about to happen. Patricia approached the stage, but Alexander signaled her to keep her distance. "I have been hired to assess whether the Crystal Palace complies with the city's current urban planning regulations." Carmen extracted a folder from her briefcase and held it against her chest like a shield. Her posture was impeccable, her tone professional, but Alexander knew enough about her to detect the tension hidden beneath that facade of technical competence. "Of course, Ms. Vance. We will be happy to cooperate with any official evaluation." The words left his mouth automatically, but his mind had traveled back 15 years. Toledo, 2010. Carmen was 28 and wore her hair in a ponytail that constantly came undone as she worked on blueprints for their small family construction company. Her hands were always stained with ink because she insisted on drawing initial sketches by hand before transferring them to the computer. "This is Matthew, my assistant for this evaluation." Carmen placed her hand on the teenager's shoulder. He had remained silent throughout the exchange. Matthew looked up at Alexander, and the physical resemblance was even more striking up close. The same green eyes Alexander saw every morning in the mirror. The same slight tilt of the head when he concentrated, even the same way he held his shoulders erect. "Nice to meet you, Matthew." Alexander extended his hand to the teenager, who shook it with a firm, direct grip. His skin was soft, without the calluses Alexander had developed during his years in construction, but there was something familiar in the way his fingers curved around his hand. "I've been studying your previous projects, Mr. Thorne. Your work in the Salamanca district was particularly innovative." Matthew's voice had the same cadence as Alexander's at that age, when he believed architecture could change the world instead of simply generating profits. The comment about the Salamanca district showed that the teenager had done his homework. That project had been one of Alexander's first commercial successes after establishing himself in Madrid. "Thank you. I'm glad to know that the new generations are interested in urban development." Patricia approached with a professional smile and a tablet in hand, ready to coordinate any necessary meeting or visit. Her efficiency had saved Alexander from awkward situations in the past, but this time, there was no protocol that could apply. "Ms. Vance, we would be happy to schedule a meeting to review all the technical documentation for the project." Carmen nodded as she put the folder back in her briefcase. Her movements were precise and economical, as if every gesture had been calculated to convey professional competence without revealing anything personal. "Perfect. I will need full access to the structural plans, environmental impact studies, and urban integration reports." Alexander watched Carmen avoid his direct gaze as she spoke to Patricia. 15 years ago, they used to spend hours discussing the technical details of each project, their heads bent over the same plans as they shared ideas and dreams about the future of sustainable construction. Torres and Bim. Construction had been more than a business partnership. It had been the embodiment of a shared vision of how architecture could improve the lives of working families. They had started with small projects in Toledo, renovating old homes, building affordable apartments for young couples, designing community spaces that strengthened the social fabric of neighborhoods. Carmen was the visionary, the one who insisted that every project should contribute to the well-being of the community. Alexander was the pragmatist, who found ways to make his partner's most ambitious ideas economically viable. Together they had created something beautiful, a company that generated profits without sacrificing values. Their romantic relationship had emerged naturally after 2 years of working together. Nights at the office, reviewing budgets, had turned into impromptu dinners with Chinese food. Trips to inspect land had transformed into weekend getaways where they mixed work and intimacy. Carmen had been the first woman who truly understood his professional ambitions. She didn't just tolerate them, she shared them and nourished them with her own passion for social architecture. They had talked about expanding to other cities, about creating a network of construction companies that prioritized social responsibility without giving up commercial success. Everything changed in March 2010. Alexander remembered every detail of that morning. Carmen had arrived late to the office, unusual for her, and had spent the first hour of the day in silence, reviewing the same documents over and over without really reading them. When she finally found the courage to speak, her words had altered the course of their lives forever. "I'm pregnant, Alexander." The news had come exactly 1 week after Michael Reed, then expansion director at Santander Bank, had offered him funding to establish himself in Madrid. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for years, the chance to play in the big leagues of Spanish real estate development. Carmen had interpreted his silence as positive shock. She had begun to talk about how they could adapt their work schedules, about the possibility of hiring additional employees to handle the operational load while she adjusted to motherhood. Her eyes shone with the same intensity she showed when designing a particularly challenging project. But Alexander had been calculating different numbers. A baby meant additional expenses, responsibilities that would limit his flexibility to travel, emotional commitments that could interfere with the difficult business decisions that business growth required. The Madrid offer included the condition that he establish himself in the capital permanently. Reed had been clear. They wanted a fully committed partner, not someone divided between multiple cities and responsibilities. The opportunity would not be repeated. Alexander had taken 3 weeks to make the decision that would define the rest of his life. The final conversation had taken place in their Toledo office, surrounded by the blueprints of projects that would never be completed. Carmen had listened in silence as he explained his reasoning. The opportunity in Madrid was too important to reject, but also too demanding to combine with responsible parenthood. He had proposed amicably dissolving the partnership. Carmen could keep the local projects, and he would assume the pending debts. It was a clean break that would allow both of them to pursue their goals without compromising the baby's well-being. Carmen had not screamed or cried. She had simply nodded and begun to pack her things from the desk they had shared for 4 years. The last time he had seen her, she was carrying a box of her architecture books to the trunk of her Seat Leon. Her belly was barely beginning to show signs of pregnancy, but she already walked with the instinctive caution of a woman protecting something precious. Alexander had left for Madrid that same week. "Mr. Thorne, we will need to schedule the technical visit for next week." Carmen's voice brought him back to the present. The guests had begun to disperse towards the cocktail on the penthouse terrace, but some journalists remained close, clearly intrigued by the dynamic they had witnessed. "Of course, Patricia will coordinate all the details with you." Matthew had taken out his notebook and was drawing something while the adults talked. His strokes were confident and precise, like someone who had spent years perfecting his technique. Alexander leaned slightly to get a better look at the drawing and discovered that it was a detailed sketch of the Crystal Palace facade, but with modifications that included vertical gardens and solar panels. Interesting perspective. Matthew looked up and smiled with the same crooked grin Alexander had inherited from his father. "I believe sustainability and luxury don't have to be opposing concepts." The phrase could have come from Carmen's mouth 15 years ago, but it had been uttered by a teenager with Alexander's face and the values he had abandoned. The cocktail on the penthouse terrace had begun as scheduled, but Alexander noticed several guests keeping their conversations low as they discreetly observed Carmen and Matthew examining the architectural plans displayed on the presentation tables. The teenager had approached the technical documents with the natural curiosity of someone who truly understood what he was seeing. Patricia circulated among the groups with her usual efficiency, but Alexander detected the tension in her movements. Carmen's unexpected appearance had altered the carefully orchestrated dynamic of the event, and his assistant struggled to maintain control of a situation that had become unpredictable. Michael Reed approached with a glass of champagne in hand and an expression that mixed professional curiosity with financial concern. As an experienced banker, he had learned to detect signs of potential problems before they materialized into financial losses. "Alexander, we need to talk about the municipal approval timeline." His voice had the neutral tone bankers used when they wanted to discuss delicate topics without alarming other investors. Alexander nodded, but his attention remained divided between the conversation with Reed and the observation of Matthew, who was now studying the structural plans with a concentration that was painfully familiar to him. The teenager had pulled a ruler from his backpack and was measuring proportions on the technical drawings. His movements were precise and methodical, like someone who had been trained to analyze architectural documents from both an aesthetic and functional perspective. "Excuse me, Mr. Thorne." Matthew's voice cut short the conversation between Alexander and Reed. The teenager had approached them with one of the plans in his hand, his expression serious but respectful. Nearby guests turned their heads towards the group, instinctively sensing that something important was about to happen. "I have some questions about the social aspects of the project." Reed frowned slightly. As an experienced banker, he knew that questions about social aspects at real estate investment events rarely led to comfortable conversations. Alexander felt the tension spread down his back, but he maintained his professional expression. "Of course, we are always open to constructive dialogue." Matthew unfolded the plan on the nearest table and pointed to a specific section of the design. His finger moved with the precision of someone who had studied the document in detail, not like a teenager asking casual questions. "I've been analyzing the space distribution, and I wonder how this project contributes to the social cohesion of the neighborhood. The apartments are priced between 800,000 and 1.5 million euros, which places them out of reach for 90% of Madrid families." The silence that followed his words was palpable. Investors exchanged uncomfortable glances as they processed the fact that a teenager had just questioned the social viability of a project in which they had invested millions of euros. Edward Vance, the mayor of Madrid, approached the group with a political smile that didn't reach his eyes. As a public official, he had developed the ability to navigate delicate conversations without compromising his official position. "That's an interesting perspective, young man. But we must remember that urban development requires significant investments that are only possible when projects generate adequate returns." Matthew nodded with the seriousness of someone who had heard that argument before and had prepared a thoughtful response. "I perfectly understand the need for economic viability, Mr. Mayor, but I have been studying mixed development models implemented in cities like Vienna and Singapore, where luxury projects include mandatory percentages of integrated social housing. This not only maintains profitability, but also strengthens the social fabric of communities." Alexander watched as the faces of the guests reflected a mixture of surprise and admiration. The teenager had not only questioned the project, he had proposed alternatives based on international research. His technical knowledge was impressive, but what truly disturbed Alexander was the passion with which he spoke about social responsibility. Carmen had approached the group and was observing the interaction with a neutral expression, but Alexander knew enough about her to detect the pride in her eyes. She had raised a son who combined technical intelligence with social awareness, exactly the values they had shared 15 years ago. "Furthermore," Matthew continued, as he pointed to another section of the plan, "the absence of community spaces accessible to the general public contributes to urban segregation. The current design creates a bubble of privilege that isolates itself from the surrounding social context." Patricia had approached with a tray of canapés, clearly trying to smooth over the moment's intensity, but no one seemed interested in the food. Everyone's attention was fixed on the teenager who had turned an investment cocktail into a seminar on social urbanism. Reed cleared his throat slightly, a sign Alexander had learned to interpret as growing financial concern. Bankers did not invest in projects that generated public controversies, especially when those controversies came from unexpected and well-informed sources. "Those are very insightful observations, young man, but I suppose you understand that modifying a project at this stage would involve significant costs and delays in the timeline." Matthew smiled with the same crooked grin Alexander had inherited from his father, but there was something different in his expression. Where Alexander had learned to use that smile to disarm commercial objections, Matthew used it to convey genuine conviction. "Of course, Mr. Reed, but we must also consider the long-term costs of urban segregation. Socially homogeneous neighborhoods tend to generate tensions that eventually require significant public investments in security and social services. Yet Alexander realized he was observing a version of himself that had never existed, someone who had developed his architectural talent without sacrificing his human values. Matthew represented the path he had abandoned when he chose financial success over social responsibility. Carmen approached Matthew and placed her hand on his shoulder with a gesture that combined maternal support and professional pride. Matthew participates in several social housing projects in neighborhoods like Vallecas and Carabanchel. Despite his age, he has already contributed to the design of community spaces that have significantly improved the quality of life for resident families. The information hit Alexander like a physical weight. His son not only talked about social responsibility, he actively practiced it. While he built luxury towers for Madrid's elite, Matthew dedicated his free time to improving the living conditions of working families. Guests began to gradually disperse, some clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. Alexander noticed several journalists remaining nearby, taking discreet notes on an exchange that could become an interesting story about urban development and social responsibility. Patricia approached him with a worried expression. "Alexander, we need to talk about handling the press for this situation." But he barely heard her. His attention was fixed on Matthew, who was now conversing with Edward Vance about municipal housing policies. The teenager spoke with the confidence of someone who had studied the subject in depth, citing specific statistics on housing deficits in Madrid and proposing concrete solutions. Carmen approached Alexander, while Matthew continued his conversation with the mayor. "We need to talk privately." Her voice had the same firmness she had shown 15 years ago when they discussed the technical aspects of their projects. Alexander nodded and followed her to a less crowded corner of the terrace where the noise of conversations provided some privacy. "Matthew doesn't know you're his father, but he knows who you are professionally. He has studied all your projects as part of his architectural training." Carmen's words confirmed what Alexander had begun to suspect. Matthew's technical knowledge of his work was no coincidence. It had been part of a deliberate educational process. He chose to specialize in social urbanism precisely because he wanted to understand how architecture can contribute to community well-being. His professors say he has a natural talent for visualizing how physical spaces affect social dynamics. Alexander watched Matthew, who was now drawing something in his notebook, while listening to Vance explain the budgetary challenges of public housing. The teenager took notes with the same intensity Alexander remembered from when he started in the business. He has won 3 youth sustainable architecture competitions in the last 2 years. His most recent project proposes a modular housing model that can adapt to different family configurations while maintaining energy efficiency. Carmen paused and looked at her son with a mixture of pride and maternal protection. "He represents everything you and I dreamed of creating together, Alexander. Technical talent combined with social awareness. The difference is that he has never had to choose between success and values." The observation hit Alexander with the force of a revelation. Matthew had grown up in an environment where professional excellence and social responsibility were not opposing concepts, but complementary ones. Carmen had managed to raise a son who embodied the vision they had shared before ambition separated them. And Alexander realized he was observing not only his son, but also an alternative version of himself, someone who had developed his potential without sacrificing his humanity. Alexander hadn't slept all night. From his apartment in the Salamanca district, he had spent the early hours of the morning researching everything he could find about Carmen Vance and her work over the past 15 years. His laptop remained open on the glass coffee table in the living room, surrounded by empty coffee cups and printed documents. The results of his search had been both revealing and painful. Carmen had specialized in social urbanism after completing a master's degree at the Polytechnic University of Madrid. Her doctoral thesis, titled Social Integration in Contemporary Urban Development, had been cited in multiple academic publications and had established the theoretical foundations for several public housing projects in the community of Madrid. He had found photographs of Carmen at international conferences, always dressed with the same professional elegance she had shown the day before, but with a confidence he didn't remember from their years together. In one particularly striking image, she appeared receiving an award from the European Association of Social Architects for her work in the rehabilitation of the Lavapiés neighborhood. Matthew appeared in several of the most recent photographs. Alexander had discovered that the teenager had won the National Youth Sustainable Architecture Competition in 2023, with a modular housing project that could adapt to different family configurations. His proposal included rainwater harvesting systems, integrated solar panels, and community spaces that fostered social interaction among neighbors. Matthew's winning project had been implemented as a pilot in the Vallecas neighborhood, where 20 families now lived in homes designed by a 14-year-old. Interviews with residents praised not only the functionality of the spaces, but also how the design had improved their neighborly relationships. Alexander closed the laptop and walked to the window overlooking Paseo de la Castellana. The glass and steel towers rose into the morning sky like monuments to his ambition. But for the first time in years, he wondered what kind of legacy they truly represented. His mobile phone vibrated with a message from Patricia. Carmen had requested an urgent meeting to present her preliminary report on the Crystal Palace. The appointment was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Madrid City Council offices. Alexander arrived at the municipal building 15 minutes early, but Carmen was already waiting in the meeting room. She had spread several documents on the conference table, and her expression was that of a professional prepared for a complex technical presentation. "Good morning, Alexander. Thank you for coming so early." Her tone was courteous but distant, as if the 15 years of shared history were irrelevant to the task at hand. Alexander sat opposite her and noticed that she had prepared 2 copies of each document, one for him and one for the official file. "I have completed my preliminary evaluation of the Crystal Palace, and I'm afraid there are several problematic aspects we need to discuss." Carmen opened the first folder and pulled out a map of the neighborhood where the complex was located. She had marked existing residential areas, available public services, and transportation routes with different colors. The analysis was exhaustive and professional. The project violates municipal urban integration regulations in 3 fundamental aspects. First, the proposed population density exceeds the established limits for this area by 40%. Second, it does not include accessible public spaces that compensate for the impact on existing community infrastructure. Alexander studied the documents as Carmen continued her presentation. Her arguments were solid and backed by irrefutable technical data. As an urban architect, she had identified real problems that his development team had overlooked or chosen to ignore. Third, and most importantly, the displacement of families currently residing in the buildings that will be demolished has not been adequately managed. We are talking about 120 families who will lose their homes without guarantees of relocation in the same area. Carmen's words hit Alexander with unexpected force. During the months of project planning, the affected families had been reduced to numbers on spreadsheets, 120 residential units that needed to be relocated to make space for urban progress. He had never thought of them as 120 families with stories, memories, and community ties that would be destroyed by his ambition. "Carmen, I understand your concerns, But you must also consider the economic benefits the project will bring to the city. We are talking about an investment of 200 million euros that will generate jobs and increase the real estate value of the entire area. She looked at him with an expression that mixed disappointment and something that might have been pity. That's exactly the kind of reasoning that has turned Madrid into a city where working families cannot afford to live. Gentrification disguised as economic progress. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Matthew, who entered the room with his school backpack and a smile that faded as he perceived the tension in the atmosphere. "Mom, classes are over. Can I wait here while you finish the meeting?" Carmen nodded and pointed to a chair at the opposite end of the table. Matthew sat down and pulled out his sketchbook, but Alexander noticed that the teenager was paying attention to their conversation while pretending to concentrate on his sketches. Alexander watched Matthew work in his notebook and realized that he had never seen his son in an everyday environment. The day before had been a formal presentation, but now he could observe his natural gestures, the way he slightly bit his pencil when he concentrated, how he tilted his head to the left when evaluating his drawings, the way he drummed his fingers on the table when he thought. All those gestures were painfully familiar because he had inherited them from him. Matthew looked up from his notebook and addressed Alexander directly with the natural curiosity of a teenager interested in architecture. "Mr. Thorne, I have a question about the construction techniques you use in your high-rise projects. How do you maintain structural stability in buildings over 30 stories without compromising energy efficiency?" The question demonstrated impressive technical knowledge for someone his age. Alexander realized that Matthew had not only studied his projects from a social perspective, but also from a purely architectural point of view. "That's an excellent question, Matthew. We use a central reinforced concrete core system combined with a perimeter steel structure that efficiently distributes loads. For energy efficiency, we integrate natural ventilation systems that take advantage of the chimney effect." Matthew's eyes lit up with the same passion Alexander remembered feeling when he was young and believed that architecture could change the world. The teenager began to draw a structural diagram in his notebook while asking additional questions about materials, foundation techniques, and climate control systems. Carmen observed the interaction between father and son with a complex expression. There was pride in her eyes at seeing Matthew's genuine interest in architecture, but also a sadness that Alexander interpreted as recognition of all that had been lost during these 15 years. "And what do you think about integrating green spaces in high-density urban developments?" Matthew continued with his questions. "I've read about projects in Singapore that include vertical gardens, which not only improve air quality, but also create microclimates that reduce energy consumption." Alexander realized he was conversing with a young version of himself, but a version that had grown up with values he had abandoned. Matthew had his natural talent for visualizing complex architectural solutions, but he had also developed a social conscience that Alexander had sacrificed in the name of commercial success. "That's a fascinating approach, Matthew. In fact, I've been considering incorporating more sustainable elements into my future projects." The words left his mouth before he could fully process them. He hadn't been considering anything of the sort until that moment, but the conversation with Matthew had awakened something that had been dormant for years. Carmen closed the document folders and addressed Alexander with an expression that had lost some of its professional coolness. "Alexander, there's something you need to know. Matthew has always known who his father is. I never hid your identity, but I respected your decision not to be present in his life." The silence that followed her words was dense and fraught with implications. Matthew had stopped drawing and was observing the two adults with a maturity that seemed to exceed his age. "Mom told me you were a very talented architect who had chosen a different path than hers. She always told me that someday, if you wanted, we could meet. Matthew's voice was calm and without resentment, as if he had accepted the situation from a young age and had learned to live with it. Alexander realized that Carmen had raised her son without bitterness towards him, which made his own absence even more painful. I've studied all your projects because I wanted to understand what kind of architect you were. Your early works in Toledo showed a social sensibility that inspired me to specialize in sustainable urbanism. Matthew paused and looked directly into Alexander's eyes. But I've also noticed how your more recent projects have moved away from those initial values. I wonder if you ever miss creating spaces that truly improve people's lives, not just generate profits. The question hit Alexander with the force of a revelation. His son had identified exactly the transformation he himself had denied for years. He had built a real estate empire, but he had lost the soul that had motivated his original passion for architecture. Alexander looked at Matthew and saw reflected not only his physical appearance, but also the version of himself he could have been if he had made different decisions 15 years ago. His son represented the path not taken, the possibility of combining professional success with personal integrity. For the first time in years, Alexander faced a truth he had been avoiding. He had built towers that touched the sky, but he had lost the connection with the earth where human lives are truly built. The headline in El País newspaper hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. Real estate mogul reunited with abandoned son during controversial project presentation. The accompanying photograph showed the exact moment Matthew had questioned the social aspects of the Crystal Palace, with Alexander observing him from the stage, with an expression that mixed surprise and recognition. Patricia had arrived at his office before dawn, with a folder full of press clippings and social media screenshots. The story had spread like wildfire through the Madrid media, fueled by the irresistible combination of family drama and urban controversy. Alexander, we need an immediate communication strategy. Investors are nervous, and the mayor has requested an urgent meeting for this afternoon. But Alexander barely heard his assistant's words. His attention was fixed on his mobile phone, where he had received a message from Carmen. Matthew wants to see you. We can meet at my office at 10. Carmen's office in central Madrid reflected exactly what Alexander had expected to find. Walls covered with blueprints of social housing projects, photographs of rehabilitated communities, and sustainable architecture awards. It was the workspace of someone who had turned their values into their profession. Matthew was sitting at a drawing table, working on what appeared to be a complex architectural project. When Alexander entered, the teenager looked up and smiled at him, with a naturalness that dramatically contrasted with the tension that had dominated their previous encounters. Mr. Thorne, I wanted to show you something. Matthew turned his notebook towards Alexander and revealed an architectural design that combined elements of luxury with social functionality. The project showed a residential complex where apartments of different price ranges were integrated organically, sharing community spaces and services. I've been thinking about your Crystal Palace project, and I believe there's a way to maintain profitability while including affordable housing. Look at these calculations. Matthew unfolded an additional sheet where he had calculated costs, profit margins, and social impact. His analysis showed that it was possible to include 30% of moderately priced homes without significantly compromising the project's profitability. The luxury apartments would partially subsidize the social units, but the added value of living in a socially diverse community could justify premium prices for higher-income buyers. Alexander studied the drawings and calculations with growing astonishment. His 14-year-old son had solved a problem that his team of architects and engineers had considered impossible. More importantly, he had found a solution that did not require sacrificing ethical principles in the name of economic viability. Carmen observed the interaction from her desk, but Alexander could feel her attention fixed on every word and gesture. The tension of the previous days had given way to something different, the possibility of constructive collaboration. "Matthew, this is extraordinary. How did you develop this approach?" The teenager shrugged with the natural modesty of someone who had not yet learned to fully appreciate his own talents. "I've been studying similar projects in other European cities. Vienna has a particularly successful model where the municipal government collaborates with private developers to create mixed communities. The key is to design spaces that foster positive social interaction between residents of different socioeconomic levels." Alexander realized he was observing a version of himself that had evolved without the limitations he had accepted. Matthew had grown up believing that technical excellence and social responsibility were complementary, not opposite. Carmen approached the drawing table and placed her hand on Matthew's shoulder with a gesture that combined maternal pride and professional respect. "Matthew has been working on this design since we returned from your presentation. I believe it represents a real opportunity to transform the Crystal Palace into something that genuinely benefits Madrid." Alexander observed the plans for several minutes, processing not only the technical implications of the design, but also the personal implications. Accepting Matthew's proposal would mean publicly acknowledging that his original approach had been deficient. It would mean admitting that a teenager had identified solutions he had overlooked, but it would also mean the possibility of rebuilding something more than an architectural project. "Carmen, Matthew, I want to propose something to you. Would you be willing to collaborate with me on the complete redesign of the Crystal Palace?" The silence that followed his proposal was dense with possibilities. Carmen exchanged a look with Matthew before responding. "We would have to establish very clear conditions about the social aspects of the project. It cannot just be a cosmetic modification to improve public image." Alexander nodded, understanding that Carmen had learned to protect herself from empty promises during the years they had spent apart. "I completely understand. I propose that we form a temporary partnership between my company and your firm. Matthew could participate as a junior consultant in sustainable architecture." Matthew's eyes lit up with an emotion Alexander recognized as identical to what he had felt when he received his first real professional opportunity. "Are you serious? I could work on a project of this magnitude?" For the first time since they had met, Alexander addressed Matthew not as the son he had abandoned, but as the talented professional he had become. "Matthew, your design demonstrates an understanding of social architecture that many professionals with decades of experience never develop. It would be an honor to work with you." Carmen observed the exchange between father and son with a complex expression. There was hope in her eyes, but also the caution of someone who had learned to protect both her heart and her son's. Alexander approached Matthew, and for the first time in 15 years, he spoke to his son about something more than architecture. "Matthew, there's something I need to tell you. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I made the most cowardly decision of my life. I chose my professional ambition over the responsibility of being your father." The teenager listened to him with the same seriousness with which he had analyzed the architectural plans. "All these years, I've built taller and taller buildings, believing that success was measured in meters of height and millions of euros. But by meeting you, I've realized that true success is measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives." Matthew remained silent for several moments before responding. "Mom always told me that people can change if they really want to. I think your proposal to work together could be the beginning of something good for everyone." Carmen approached both of them and spoke with the voice of someone who had learned to balance hope with realism. "Alexander, I am willing to collaborate with you, but I need concrete guarantees. The project must include a minimum of 30% social housing, community spaces accessible to the general public, and a dignified relocation plan for the displaced families. I accept all your conditions, Carmen. More than that, I want you to personally oversee all social aspects of the project. 6 months later, Alexander found himself back on a stage in front of investors and media. But this time, the presentation was completely different. Beside him were Carmen and Matthew, and behind them rose a model of the integrated palace, the project that had emerged from their collaboration. The new design combined luxury apartments with social housing so organically that it was impossible to distinguish between them from the exterior. The community spaces included a health center, a public library, and communal gardens that had been designed by Matthew. Ladies and gentlemen, the integrated palace represents a new approach to urban development in Madrid. It's not just a residential complex. It's a community that demonstrates that architectural excellence and social responsibility can coexist. The investors had initially been skeptical, but the numbers had eventually convinced them. The project not only maintained the projected profitability, but it also attracted government subsidies and international recognition that had increased its brand value. Matthew approached the microphone with the confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. This project demonstrates that the next generation of architects doesn't have to choose between commercial success and social impact. We can build a Madrid that is both prosperous and inclusive. Alexander watched his son speak with the same passion he had felt years ago, but with a wisdom he had taken decades to develop. He realized that the true legacy was not the buildings he had constructed, but the values he had rediscovered through his son's eyes. Carmen approached him after the presentation and smiled with a warmth he hadn't seen in 15 years. "I think we've finally built something worthwhile." Alexander nodded, knowing she was referring to much more than the integrated palace. They had rebuilt a family, redefined a career, and demonstrated that it's never too late to choose the right values. As he watched Matthew explain the technical aspects of the project to a group of journalists, Alexander understood that he had found something more valuable than financial success: the possibility of using his influence to create a better world for future generations. What do you think about Alexander's journey? Do you believe he truly changed, or was it just for show? Leave your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, and like this video if it moved you.